There's a book called When and Where I Enter by Paula Giddings. She's a social historian, and what she's basically writing is kind of a political history of Black women. And in it, she's talking about different forms of resistance, like before she gets into like, political organizing. And I think she kind of starts the book with Ida B. Wells, but she kind of then steps back and looks at slavery, and she starts looking at different forms of resistance, whether that's kind of everyday resistance, where I think which some people kind of term as like, kind of work sabotage or work slowdowns. And then she gets into what I think historians now call gynecological resistance, which is, using herbal abortives to thwart their master's attempts to use their procreation to create more workers and more enslaved workers. And so in the book, she's kind of, she's citing, there's another, I could go down the rabbit hole of sources, but she basically she talks about this anecdote where there was this farm in Tennessee, where between 4 and 5 enslaved women were kept, and they controlled the birth rate on their farm for like 20 years. In that time period, only 2 children were born. And at the end of it, I guess around maybe, maybe I would say around the 20-year mark, the master found out that there was an old woman who was giving the younger women quote unquote an herbal remedy, basically an herbal abortive. And that episode is chronicled in a medical journal, and it ends up being something that a doctor at a doctor's conference kind of gives a report on, because he's trying to kind of tell other doctors what they should be aware of. So the larger sources from this other book, and in that book, Herbert Gutman's The Black Family Under Slavery and Freedom, if anyone's interested. But in that book, what he chronicles are these basically battles that are happening between enslaved women and the people they own them, and the doctors who are employed to kind of like mediate these things. And yeah, and it's just an interesting terrain, I feel like, that we haven't really kind of seen explored.
Gynecological resistance. Mm-hmm. That's a new term. I like that.
Yeah, it becomes very relevant in these days, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think too, like, about the historical record when it comes to slavery, and in the case of this book, female slavery in particular. I'm wondering from a research perspective, like, how much is available? How much of the historical record from like a slave-centered POV is preserved? Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Mm-hmm.
They have access. They didn't have access to education oftentimes, or probably like writing utensils or anything to like preserve what happened. In most cases, I would imagine.
Right. I think very fortunate for me, there are a number of Black women, I would say historians, who over the last, I would say maybe 30, 40 years, that have kind of taken up really trying to look at women's lives in particular. And so they've done a lot of work in terms of like going through, I would say, like stuff like the WPA narratives, I think, are a big one, even though I know a lot of people have problems with those.
Wait, what is that? What is that?
Those were the Writers Project. Remember the big Writers Project, like I think in the 50s, when during, like, after the Depression, when writers were kind of like, the government employed writers to do these different projects. And one of them was to go out and go down to the South and to interview older African Americans who had grown up under slavery. And so by then, a lot of them who were interviewed, maybe they were like 70, 80. They were a lot of them, most of them were, to be honest, children when emancipation happened. So I feel like, so those are all kind of lumped under what's called, I guess, the WPA narratives. And there's usually a set of narratives for every state. And so in that state, you'll have, basically, they have interviewed like 50 African Americans. And you'll get lots of different detail about what people ate, when's the last time they've seen their family, what they remember. So those are kind of, I feel like, and then the funny thing about that is that, like, so the WPA did this research, and then they kind of went into a vault, and then they weren't kind of discovered until the 70s. And so that's when, like, historians started using them and kind of using them as a primary source. The other thing that people started to use recently as a primary source, which is fascinating, are pension records. And those are basically the pension records of, like, Civil War widows. who were, who at this point, like, your husband was in the war, you're trying to file for a pension. And because the records of who African Americans were married to, because marriage under slavery was so tumultuous and people didn't really honor your marriage, there's no contract. There would be all this kind of like, there would be all these like detailed interviews to figure out who you were married to, what was the chain, were you still married by the time the soldier passed away? And those become very also rich resources to understanding like how people lived under that period.
And so were you combing through some of this stuff?
I was combing through some of that stuff because there was a period where I was going to do a kind of a longer kind of thread. And so, yeah, so I was reading some of the pension records, but I will put most of that amazing research, I would say, comes from like historians like Tara Hunter and Randy Brimmer. And then there's another book called Voices of Emancipation that pulls together a bunch of interviews from pension records, and those are amazing too.
Okay. So the story that we referenced early from Paula Giddings' book, it's a true story. It takes place in Tennessee, this gynecological resistance. And your novel is set in the 1850s, 1852, I believe, and it takes place in Texas. I'm curious about that choice. Like, if you had this Paula Giddings thing happening in Tennessee, and you yourself, I believe, were raised in Georgia, correct?
Well, I'm from Chicago, but my mom's people are from Georgia. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I read somewhere that you had Georgia roots.
Yeah, I have Georgia roots.
But you went to Texas for graduate school. So I'm just trying to kind of follow the thread of how we wound up in Texas for this story.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think here's the thing too. I think with having that original anecdote is that I actually don't know where that happened. Right? It's in a Tennessee medical journal, but I don't know if the doctor who tells that story at that particular conference is a doctor in Tennessee, or is he a doctor in a neighboring state? Also, the way the records are kept, he doesn't tell us what farm it's from, at least in terms of like the record that we have of that particular incident. So it's one of these things where it's like, because the archive is what it is, there are always questions. There are always a lot of things that are left out. I think especially in terms of like African-American history. But I would say how I got to Texas was I think my first draft of the book was in Georgia, because that's where I would go as a kid and would have a little bit of a relationship to, like, my mom's family's from a small town called Thomaston. And so those are kind of my memories of like the deep South, the rail dirt roads, the land that my grandfather owned. But when I moved to Texas for grad school, I got really inspired by Texas. It's one of the few places that still has a very strong regional identity. That 7 years of the Texas Republic still lives very large for them.
I was going to say, people from Texas, they are very concerned with being from Texas. Like, in ways, like, I'm from the Midwest and I could care less. I mean, I love the Midwest, but like, calm down, Texas. We get it.
It's so true. It's so true. It's like I've their whole like, I feel like that ethos of like Texas as an independent nation for them is still very real. Like, even the stuff we saw with the power grid, like, they're them being the only state in the union that has their own grid, mainly because they didn't want to be told what to do. So I think when I got there, I got very inspired by Texas, just because I can make sense of it, I think, in a certain way. I think, again, coming from Chicago and having lived in New York and DC, and I think I started thinking about the question of slavery in Texas and why we never think of slavery as connected to Texas, even though it was a huge part of even though, granted, it happened later because of when Texas joined the Union, but the whole question of like how Texas becomes part of the Union, the Mexican-American War, what the state is of American empire, and how far would the American empire go, like past Texas, past Central America, all of those questions that the nation was wrestling with in the 1840s, 1850s are all part of, Texas is a big part of those questions. So it just seems strange that like we often leave that out of the dialogue. It's like Texas, cowboys, California, gold rush. And that's kind of it. And the more I started researching, it just seemed like not only was that like an interesting omission in terms of like, if you were enslaved in Texas, and you want to escape to freedom, you're going to run to Mexico. And I just felt like we hadn't really explored those stories.
I didn't realize that. That was one of the things I was going to ask you about, like later in the conversation. But since you bring it up, there's a slave named Noah who takes off. I hope I'm not spoiling too much, but takes off and goes south to a place. God, what is it called again? It's called Nacimiento de los Negros. This was a real place?
That's a real place. That is a real place. And that was a place where there were enslaved African Americans who absconded from Texas, from Oklahoma, from those particular states, and that's where they would go. And the border, and the fights around the border lands are so interesting because all the different players, which I feel like someone who really knows Texas, I feel like I'm waiting for that novel where it's like what you get on the borderlands, where you have escaped Africans who have banded with Native Americans. The Mexican government has said, hey, you all can have this land right here near the border if you stop white people from coming over here. Because at that point, and then you have, at the same time, you have Mexicans who are under debt peonage, who are kind of, going toward Texas, leaving Mexico to escape their debt. And Africans who are running toward Mexico. And then you have the Texas Rangers who are basically trying to like go into Mexico and bring the Africans back. Because, they're basically bounty hunters, basically, right? They're hired to bring them back. So like that history is wild. And I was like, that's an amazing adventure novel that I can't write, but but I feel like I'm waiting on someone to write, about Caballo Jack and some of these figures, and all the things that are happening there, because it's a wild history.
Wait, who's Caballo Jack?
Caballo Jack is like, he was this, I think there's another name for him too, but he's basically like, basically a runaway slave, or basically enslaved African who I think at some point just basically becomes like a pirate, sort of, right? Kind of a pirate figure who basically has a band of like escaped enslaved folks, Native Americans, and they all have kind of created this like kind of just band of men who are kind of living on the border, who are kind of like, and so it's like, it's wild. I just feel like I don't even know enough detail about it, but I feel like the little bit I read about him, I'm like, this is a whole about.
There's a story
here. There's a story or a movie or something here.
Well, and I'm going to ask you just to slide your microphone away just a little bit.
Oh, sure.
Just a little bit further from your face, not too much.
Okay, maybe I'd sit back.
Okay, yeah. Let me hear let me just hear you talk when you're sitting back a little bit. I want to hear the difference.
Okay. Let's see. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Okay. Yeah. So I'm curious too about Nacimientos de los Negros in terms of what is there now. Are there any remnants of this colony like in existence today, or no?
I don't know. I think my sources for that were, there were a couple of people who wrote some great dissertations about those different forms of migration that were happening before the Civil War. And I know that there are people who have done some like documentaries and research on basically the descendants of those communities, descendants of enslaved Africans who moved there. And so I've seen a little bit of that. I remember knowing someone who was doing some research on that, but I haven't dug kind of more into kind of like, what's the state? Does that town still exist? Has that town been morphed into another town? And I think and I remember reading something in the WPA about an enslaved African American who had basically went to Mexico, kind of like absconded to Mexico, made it there. He just basically waited out the war and then came back and like found his family. And so he ended up settling in Texas. So I wonder if there was also like a lot of that type of migration happening too. Some people who would settle and stay and this is home, but other people who were just like, I'm just going to wait till it's better. If there's a better,
Right. What an interesting history. I had no idea. And I'm curious too, when it comes to writing about this period and these people, what you had to do, because it reads like in a lived in sort of way, it reads authentically. And I'm curious about dialect, the logistics of plantation life. And one of the challenges too is that, and I think this is part of your concern creatively, is that plantation life is different from region to region and from time to time within the context of the history of slavery.
For sure.
It was not a static institution. It was fluid. It was regional. It was determined, like the life and the logistics were determined by what crops were being harvested? What was the moneymaker? And so I'm curious, when it comes to Texas slavery in particular, like what you did to zero in on the language of the time, the logistics of the time and place.
Yeah. I would say probably boring things, like, read a lot of books about Texas. And I would also say I tried to read a lot about small farmers in particular, because I was interested in that distinction between being a small struggling farmer versus, I think, what the typical idea of a plantation owner is, which is, Jefferson with Monticello and like these huge grand estates, with 100 people working, in the fields or in the background. And I feel like, I feel like I need to have that statistic on hand, but most of the farmers were small farms. Most slaveholders only owned maybe less than 10 people. So, in that situation, you may not have, quote unquote, an overseer. You may be out there, alongside your enslaved workforce, working alongside them, which was an interesting class distinction between slaveholders themselves, right? Like, if you had to work yourself and get dirt under your fingernails versus being able to sit on your horse and dictate what's happening or not. So yes, I was interested in those. I was interested in those class distinctions among white people as well as the diversity, to me, among enslaved African Americans, right? Where it's like, it is shaped by what region, what time period, if you have still connection to Africa or not, if you are, second generation or third generation, what religion you practice. Yeah, there's just so many different factors. And I feel like a lot of times our depictions of enslaved African Americans are typically kind of one note or kind of flat. And all that is kind of melded in this idea of like slavery is one experience. Like, I initially didn't even want to have them work in cotton, because I was just like, I need to do rice or something. I just need to, like, indigo
Soybeans.
or something. Yes,
Soybeans.
something else or whatever. And so even though people are also, working diversified crops anyway, like, because just crop rotation, you have to. But unfortunately, part of the lore of Texas, or part of the yield of Texas, was that it, it's booming after the cotton boom in the 1830s. It's booming after industrialization. And so it is cotton. That is a thing that's kind of drawing people. That's like, that they're going to make their fortune in cotton.
Well, I'll tell you this, reading this novel made me just acutely aware of the hell of a Texas summer doing hard labor outside. Like, geez, like the hell of all of this, you know what I'm saying? It's just so overwhelming. But I think the elements and the backbreaking hard work that it takes to run a farm, of any kind. And it's hard today, even
sure.
like in an industrialized farming era. I have a friend who was a farmer from like age 20 to just last year. And the reason he quit was because his body was giving out in his mid 40s. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's like, I get up and I can barely stand up, that sort of stuff. So I think about this time and how much, especially like in a resource deprived situation, in a place that, especially in the summer, can be as uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. The bugs, the heat, the snakes, just like, oh my God, not fun, right? Like, just awful. And so much of the labor, the worst of the labor, obviously fell on the slaves. And the story that you're telling here is centered on female slaves, mm-hmm. who were not spared from hard labor in any respect, right?
For sure. Yeah, I think that's the thing I think is interesting about I would say, as Americans, our quote unquote frontier myth, right? It's like, I think at some point I was reading Stuart Onan's Prayer for Dying? It's basically supposed to be, I think it's post Civil War. I think a Union soldier, and he moves to like, I know it's inspired by like Wisconsin Death Trip, and it's kind of like, but he's in a frontier kind of like Midwestern city that like, the city comes down with, let me say town, and a town comes down with diphtheria. And it's kind of about, and I think it's inspired by Wisconsin Death Trip, which was that weird photographic book about frontier Americans who were basically moved to the frontier, and it was so brutal that they were just like drinking cyanide because they were just like, I can't. They're like, what the fuck did we? Sorry, can I curse? Can I? Like,
you can curse.
Yeah, sorry. They were just like, what did we do?
Right.
And so yeah, they were just kind of like, almost like committing suicide because it was just too much in terms of just the elements and the hell of like trying to build a town out of nothing.
Well, yeah, it's funny because I've in the past many times have idealized the frontier in that like Dances with Wolves kind of way.
Right.
Like, you're living this pure existence out on this beautiful landscape, and it's like whatever, like the winter comes and it's not so cute anymore. And not only that, but like where are you getting your food, and what kind of shelter do you have, and the pests and bugs and all of it without infrastructure that's not an easy life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say I think that was interesting too. I think when in some of the research, I think I would read letters. There's a collection of letters from I think a planter who moved from Georgia, and he set up in Texas, and you can see the shift in idealism, right? The first letters are, oh my God, it's amazing, it's just wheat, there's just buffalo just roaming just for the taking, and it's like, and he, and he's just, and like the language is almost like he describes it as if it's Eden or something, right? It's like it's this like beloved, rich, plentiful land. He's telling his, his relatives, oh, just come out. It's going to be amazing. And then a couple of years ago, like that first freeze hits, and then another freeze hits, and then, then the summer comes and everything dies off the crop. And like, it's just, and then the locust hit, and then his youngest child dies. And it's just like, you just see like inch by inch how like it all just like, none of it pans out. And so, yeah, I think so often that's the interesting part of that story. I feel like we often don't want to explore.
Well, but you're right about like a lot of times the narratives that we are told, or the narratives that we tell ourselves about this period, is pretty one note. There's the slaves, and then there's the bad plantation owners, and the slaves are kind of treated as like a monolith. And one of the things I loved about your novel is the fact that like the slaves don't all get along.
Right. Yep.
They don't all like each other. It's not like they're all just like singing in the fields in harmony or something. Like these are complex human beings who have different agendas, different temperaments, different ways of coping with the trauma and stresses of life in this place. Like, it's one of these things where like once you stop and think about it, you're like, I think people would actually be more inclined. Well, I guess, I don't know. Sometimes when you're in a shared trauma, it can bond you, obviously, in a really deep way. But I also think that like when you're under that much pressure, it could create divisions and conflicts and really moody behavior.
For sure. I think both are true. Yeah, I think both are true. And I think I wanted to explore that tension of it. We don't like each other, and we may not like each other all the time. And other times that is gonna, forge a bond because there's something bigger than us that we have to kind of contend with. But other times also, because of the stress of the situation, it also is just gonna make me hate you more because we have to live on top of each other in this way. Like, we have to work together. There's no break from you.
Well, yeah, there's competition too. There's competition because it's like, who's going to be the house? Like, there's different roles on the plantation or the farm. It's like, who's the house slave? Who's working in the fields and doing the physical labor? And does somebody who works indoors have like some sort of advantage over the others? And I could see how there could be even a hierarchy happening, for them, and how that could lead to tension.
Yeah, for sure. And even some of those things, I think I was trying to kind of I would say play within the novel too, because I do think there's like a notion in, I would say, contemporary American consciousness about, quote unquote, the house slave versus the field slave. But I don't necessarily believe that distinction was as clear.
Right.
I think I was just saying the research I've done, and I'm sure, I'll allow historians to, correct me, but I feel like I've seen it where, especially if you're working on a small farm, some of those notions are fluid, where it's like, so again, it's one thing if you're on an estate with 100 people, then you could have very designated roles about, these people are the artisans and the blacksmiths, and these people are whatever. But if it's a small farm, you have to get in where you fit in. And that could mean that someone who is primarily doing housework or is also maybe sometimes out in the field as well. But I think more interesting, I think the thing I was interested in was that I didn't necessarily think being, I think often there's this notion that the house slave, quote unquote, or the house enslaved African American had it better. And I don't necessarily buy that. It could be better in the sense that it's protection from the elements, but you are closer. You live closer to the owners. You have no privacy. You are always under surveillance. You are always at the hand and beck and call of the slaveholder, right?
Well, and it's also the female slaves in particular are doing cooking,
mm-hmm.
childcare,
mm-hmm.
wet nursing,
all of it.
You know, all of it. Like, that's not glamorous work.
It's
that's
not.
Like,
yeah.
That's backbreaking work, and it's and like you say, you're right there under the thumb of the boss all the time. So
all the time, 24 hours.
I'd rather be out in the field.
Yeah, 24 hours. I mean, at least I would say in the situation of the field, you do have, when the day is done, you may have a couple of hours to yourself, maybe, depending upon, your living situation. But, but 24 hours a day where you're right next to somebody who is expected, you just, to serve their every whim. Like, yeah, I feel like people idealize that, and I don't think that was better. I think they were both hard.
No doubt. And in the story that you're telling, just so listeners can be oriented, the farm is owned by a couple named, was it Charles and Lizzie Harlow?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Charles and Lizzie Harlow. So this is a struggling farm in Texas. Lizzie is from Georgia, or are they both from Georgia? I know Lizzie has family back in Georgia.
Yeah, Lizzie's from Georgia.
And she's kind of along for the ride. Charles is out seeking his quote unquote fortune, but it's not really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this story, in the struggle to survive, in Charles and Lizzie's struggle to survive, they hatch a plan to essentially breed.
Mm-hmm.
That's a crude way of putting it, but that's really
that's
what they were thinking. We're going to breed our slaves and create more slaves, and it's going to enrich us. And the 6 female slaves on this farm at the core of this story are resisting that, the gynecological resistance that we started out by talking.
Yeah.
We started out talking about. And, I guess like Toni Morrison, Beloved, that book is about this. But this book really brought into focus for me, like, the awful risks and costs of childbearing, of friendship, like just friendship when you're a slave, any kind of intimacy, romantic love. You have a child as an enslaved woman in 19th century America or 18th century America, and they just take the child, sell the child, bring the child indoors to play with the kid while you're out in the field. You never see him again. Like, horrendous.
Yeah.
Horrendous. Like, no wonder that they didn't want to bear children. The costs are just too high. And likewise, like, just becoming close as a friend, because all of a sudden they ship your friend off or kill your friend. Like, that stuff happened all the time, and just painful to read about and to think about the burdens borne by women in particular.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that was the thing I was interested in the most, was, I think, especially with exploring the lives of, I would say, the 6 women. And even though, of course, I feel like they all have different stories, and we hear from some of them more than others. But I think I was just interested in all the different variations of that experience, motherhood, losing a child, being able to see your child, but not really be able to mother them the way you want to. I think with Junie, we see like her children are long distance, and her relationship with Lizzie for her is squarely trying to find out if her children are okay. Also, just the relationships, the marriages, or romantic relationships of any kind, like just the type of stresses that people were put under in terms of trying to stay together, and how that affected your relationship with one another. I just felt like there was so much that I wanted to explore. We're just like really looking at the interior lives and the private lives enslaved African Americans that I just felt like I hadn't seen.
I think too, like, just 19th century pregnancy period, like, no matter who was carrying a child in that heat, like third trimester. I'm just like, oh my God.
Dangerous.
And then like childbirth, giving birth in like a room with like people, I mean, or just like squatting and having a baby in the hoy. As somebody, I've witnessed a couple of births. So, I mean, it's like, to me, that's a medical event. I guess it's very natural. Maybe I'm too far removed from my roots, but like I was very happy to be at Cedar Sinai with some help. Like I am not one of these people who's like, just get in the tub, it'll be fine. Like I want a team of doctors. But it really, it really brought that to bear. And I think of Sarah. Is that the way to pronounce it? Sarah?
It's just Sarah, yeah.
Oh, Sarah, okay.
Yeah, just Sarah.
But Sarah's story in particular, and her ordeal with that, and how like the farm owners, slave owners would like even physically beat and abuse pregnant slaves, like just awful behavior. And yet in this novel, and to your credit, I think, there is dimensionality given to the Harlows, who are called the enslaved women on the farm call them the Lucys, which is short for Lucifer, which I quite liked. That felt like the kind of thing people would do, right? You got to code name some people, but the Lucys or the Harlows are human beings in these pages instead of just like boogie men or boogie women. Like they're awful, but they're human. Yeah. And I think too, like some of the costs of white supremacy and racism are drawn into this book. You can see how it impacts them negatively,
for sure,
as well as the slaves,
for sure.
And I thought that was like a good creative choice. Like so many, like again, the one note nature of these narratives, as they are imagined or told, a lot of times that is done away with here. Everybody here in this book is like round and fully human. And I felt in particular for Lizzie, having all these kids and having a husband who's kind of checked out, and she's stuck on this farm in Texas. Like I had like a twinge of sympathy for her. So, kudos to you for making me feel that, because it was not easy,
Yeah, I've heard people say that before. They're like, I felt something and I didn't want to feel anything about her.
Right. But, I think too, like, and maybe this is because I'm a white guy reading this, but when I read slavery narratives, a lot of times what I'm thinking is like, there's got to be somebody on this fucking farm who's like, this is wrong. We got to, what I'm saying? Like, where is there's never like a moral epiphany among these people. Like, it just seems so, it seems so crazy to me. And I want to have a dialogue about this, because maybe I'm wondering if like you stumbled upon anything in your research that might shed light on this, but the moral awfulness of slavery is not subtle.
Right. No.
You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not something that's like sort of like shades of gray. Like maybe it's okay. No, it's like, it's just so obviously awful on a human level that like, you watch a movie like 12 Years a Slave, for example, makes you like physically ill. Like, at least for me, it's like you recoil, just like reflexively from it. And yet this institution persisted in the American South for generations, decades, centuries, whatever. And everybody was sort of on board with it. White people were sort of on board with it. And the ones who weren't, I guess, were ostracized or jailed, or, I mean, there might've been legal costs for them. I don't know the history well enough to know, but like, I have to believe there was somebody out there who had a reaction to this and was like, you know what, maybe we ought to rethink this. And I'm sure maybe their stories have been told. I don't think they were in the majority. And the other thing that I think about is a line from, I believe, what's the guy who wrote Upton Sinclair? It's this famous like line of his that I'm going to botch, where basically he's saying that if a person is making their living from a certain industry or in a certain way, they will convince themselves of its moral rectitude or rightness, no matter the costs. If that's how they make their bread. And so, like, as I'm sitting here wrestling with, like, how could people be on board with this? The only thing I can come up with is just like, A, they're just wrongheaded and sociopathic and evil. But I think I got to believe that's maybe the minority. I think a lot of times people just go along with how things are and don't really think about it, or they're making their money from it. And so they just convince themselves that it must be right. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I guess everybody wonders, like, how the fuck did this happen? And yet it happened, and it has happened in other places too. You know, it's just human awfulness.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that I was kind of interested in that psychology, but I didn't want to make them cartoons. I thought the book would be less to make them cartoons. I think it was it'd be too easy to just make them kind of cartoonish villains, right? And I am interested in the psychology of it. I think there are a couple of journals by kind of slaveholding mistresses, and they're fascinating pieces of of literature.
But like twisted too, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, some of them are very twisted. Where by that I mean, like, I think I could kind of grab it if you want to know which one. But there's one. I think it's a plantation mistress on the eve of the Civil War, and it's the journals of. I have to get the book to remember what her name is, but but you could see her fighting with the tension, but the tension is not that that owning other people is abhorrent, even though she's a very devout Christian. Her issues are that she doesn't know why the people that she quote unquote claims to own hate her, and why they treat her that way, or why, a lot of it's like, it's not it's about control. Like, she's just like, they're insolent and they're this and they're, you know what I mean? And her prayers to God are often like, I can't wait, God, rid us of these people. It's like, you did this. You were still doing this.
yeah.
And so, so I think the psychology is fascinating. It's like, and some of them, I think some of the things I think were inspired by her, I definitely gave to Lizzie, like these kind of notions of like, that they are these are crosses to bear for her, right? Like, dealing with these folks are crosses to bear. And it's like, you could literally just free them today. You don't have to see them.
Yeah, that's a question I have historically. I should know this better, but like, could somebody in Texas in 1852 have just freed his slaves and said, "You're free, go"?
I have to look again. Technically, a man probably definitely could. I mean, women definitely had, and there's a great book on Stephanie Jones Rogers, They Were Her Property, on white women's role. So like, where I think a lot of times there's this question of like, where sometimes people will kind of see, and it's just like, well, a lot of the wives were just along for the ride. No, a lot of them owned property. A lot of them had their dowries that were in enslaved people. Like, so they were, they were the people who were negotiating wet nurses and like renting wet nurses. So like, they were very involved. Well,
I mean, just the notion that you give a slave as a wedding gift.
Oh yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. And that when someone died, that was when there was so much anxiety among enslaved African Americans, because at that point they know that who is going to be dispersed, like who's going to be given away in the will to other relatives, was often like a thing. So like, sometimes I think if someone died, people would just start running, or just like runaways, because they knew, like, it's just like, you don't know how it's going to fall. Whether that's going to be debt collection, or again, which cousin were you left to in the will, and were your children also left to that person? Like, it's just, insane.
Well, the story that you're telling here, and the treatment and abuse that these people endured, had me, if I'm being totally honest, as I was reading, I was conducting an alternative, like, I was desperate to save them, which you often are when you're reading about people who are like innocent people, like in peril. It's natural, I think, to want to be like, how do we get them, so I kept thinking in my head, I was imagining, like, if I was a farmer in Texas, I would create like a situation where they had like they owned the land too, and we could have a collective and we would get along. I was actually like thinking, like, how could you, but then I guess you could just say you're free. If that was an option, you just free them.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trying to imagine like how to co-resist and create a haven, because I was just like, it's hard to stomach kind of witnessing what's going on. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway,
You
kudos to you for rendering it realistically, making me squirm.
I mean, you could free them. They would probably have to leave Texas, though.
I mean, yeah. And then how do they get there and all this stuff?
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
you know, it's not that long ago either, really, in the arc of
No.
history that this was going on. And it's just depressing as hell to contemplate that this is where things were not too long ago. And there are people today who would probably be just fine if it were to revert, you know, and that's a problem.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I feel like there's so many. I don't want to say parallels, and by that I don't mean like direct parallels, but I just mean some of the things around psychology, around that period, around class and working white class, and like, you know, and the other people who maybe quote unquote didn't participate, but not because they didn't want to, but just because they didn't have enough money to own other people, right?
Couldn't get in on the game.
Couldn't get in on the game, right? And that.
Yeah.
Right. And that a lot of the ways, I think Emmett Morgan writes about this, but a lot of the ways that they would kind of like, you know, get working class farmers on board, or, you know, poor farmers especially, or poor men who own land but maybe didn't own slaves and had to rent slaves, quote unquote. You know, the way they got them on board, which is the same way I think what we've seen with Trump, right? The way they get them on board is to say, oh, but all this could be yours. All this should be yours, right? This dream is possible for you too. You just have to
buy some Trump water and
right,
a Trump coin
and some vitamins.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I feel like the psychology of some of those things are still very much with us. You know, so it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, it lingers. I mean, you've spent time in the South. My family, my parents are from Louisiana. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Wisconsin and Indiana, but I've been down there a bunch, and like, I feel like it's very much still in the South. And I feel like some of the resentments have lingered. Do you know what I'm saying? Like post-Civil War defeat resentments, the South shall rise again, that sort of stuff, you know?
For
like,
sure. That is like alive.
That is alive. And Texas, you know, like Texas is going to come back or something like that. And that to me is offensively dumb. It's like, no, we should be like, okay, that was a nightmare and we're glad it's over. But yet they want to like somehow resurrect some past greatness that was never great. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you as well, because, you know, we've talked about the dimensionality that you've given to the female slaves in this story and to even the Harlows or the Lucys who are the slave owners. But something else that your book does that I had not seen before, done this well, is it brings into focus issues around masculinity and the way that male slaves were reduced to stockmen or just breeders. Like they were literally hired out to just come impregnate women. That is a brutal existence. And I think Zeke, the stockman in the book, is married, in love with a woman, has children, doesn't want to really be doing this, but is just resigned to his job. That's the way he read to me on the page, at least to some degree, you know. So the women are obviously resentful of him and want nothing to do with him. And he's in a tough place because if he doesn't do his job, he's going to get beaten or killed and won't be able to see his wife and kids. And I mean, what a hellish role. He's got to leave his family and go do this, you know, just completely inhuman. So that side of masculinity, like slave, like male slaves having to sort of, you know, deal with that kind of abuse and treatment. And then there were also two other characters in the book, and I gotta think of their names. It's Isaac and Monroe. And I felt like you explored masculinity really well in their characters, because Monroe, you know, both of them are essentially tasked with impregnating. That's the story here, right? We've got to breed and grow our slave population to keep the farm alive. And they come at their task in different ways. And I think the character of Isaac in particular moved me, because he's a decent guy and a spiritual guy and a family guy. He's got a wife, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah. But I just remember he's kind of quiet and decent, and the way that it happens on the farm, which is, I'm assuming, the way that it happened all the time in the American South, was that they would marry you off. You know, they would say, okay, you two are going to couple, be basically like an arranged marriage or an arranged coupling. And you were essentially commanded to procreate. And so from a logistical perspective, what does that mean? Well, there's maybe a little bit, there's like a tiny cabin, like a falling down cabin, and they just essentially stick you in there, and there's a single bed, which, you know, that was a detail that sort of haunted me when it came to Sarah and Monroe, where she's in love with another guy, and then suddenly she's put into this arranged relationship, and there's just this one single mattress, and the guy is he's not so great. It's kind of creepy. Just like, oh my God, you know, like it's an awful situation. But I just thought that, like, the way that you gave Zeke and Monroe and Isaac each their own agenda and personality and background made me understand more deeply what the guys were going through when it came to, in particular, procreation and sexuality and relationships, because, you know, the burdens were theirs to bear too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's an interesting level of, there's an interesting area of research that historians are kind of looking into now, which is thinking about how men were sexually abused under slavery. And some of that is, you know, in the form kind of in terms of what we see with Zeke, but also, you know, just, you know, rape of men, rape of children, like that, those were things that were also part of it. Like, yeah. And so,
but also forcing men to essentially rape women
for sure. Yeah.
Like, that's a fucked up thing to do to somebody who doesn't want to, you know, if the guy's on board with it, then it's doubly fucked up. But if it's like the guy's like, I don't want to do this, but you have a gun in your hand and you're pointing it at me, like, what is the guy going to do? You know, like, that's not an easy situation. So it's just horrendous.
Yeah.
And not something that I've seen talked about a lot or written about a lot.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too I was interested in was, like, if you read any, like, I would say some of the accounts of this and then in the narratives I would see, I think misunderstand these men, right? There'll be an account of a man who was tasked with doing this, and, you know, and in the account he's quote unquote bragging, right? He's like, oh, you know, I had so many kids and I did all this, da da da, and I don't buy that account. This is the thing. What I think there's what Sadia Hartman talks about, that we have to, like, read against the grain of the archive, that we can't necessarily.
Who talks about this?
There's a historian, Sadia Hartman. She wrote a book. She's kind of book called Scenes of Subjection. She's amazing. All of us are writing in her wake. But one of the things that she says, I think especially for African Americans, when you are using these sources, and sources that are not necessarily, that don't render Black people as human or don't believe Black people to be human, that you have to kind of read against the grain of the source, right? So the source is telling you one thing on its face, but you kind of have to read against it. You have to kind of read in between the lines of it. You have to kind of engage it with questions and not necessarily take what it says at face value.
That makes sense, though. That makes sense because, I mean, you don't know what the agenda is or what pressures are being brought to bear on this person, but you also don't. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine the psychological impacts of that level of trauma,
for sure,
and how it would impact memory and a person's sense of self. And then there comes into play, like, the lack of education often, and you know, the resources that a person would need to even begin to cope in a serious way with going through something like that. So that makes sense, you know, that you would have to try to find ways to connect dots or read between the lines to get to the truth.
For sure. I think also too, it's like, it's also it's also, I feel like, just like the human nature that if someone, you know, sticks a mic in your face, like in a quote unquote WPA interview, and asks you about an experience who you don't know, right? What you say to that person depends on how you want to render that experience for them. It has nothing to do with how you feel about it. You know what I mean? It's often about, I feel like, you know, the shield that you put up to protect yourself from something like really dark and horrific that you don't want to necessarily let the stranger into. And so, yeah, so I just, yeah, I think it was reading about those experiences. I was like, there's another thing here. And I just want to explore that. Like, let's look at what that was like for them as well.
Yeah. You know, as I sit here listening to you and thinking about all this, it really does strike me. Like, I'm wondering about, you know how like when you read a novel and it activates your imagination and you might start telling yourself like a story of your own on a parallel line, or even inserting yourself into the story. Like, I can't think of a book that I've read in recent memory that had me doing this to this degree. I was like frantically imagining escape routes and like do you know what I'm saying? Like you must, I feel like this must be the common for any decent reader. Like you read a story like this and you're like, okay, all right, well, steal a horse. Just take a fucking horse and ride.
You're like, just go.
Yeah, like I would be like, I would stockpile water. Like you got to stockpile water and food. Like I was just constantly imagining, like I would save up money. I would buy a farm. I would buy as many slaves as I could. And then like we would form a commune. Like, I just wonder if there is any truth to the notion that narratives like this are more generative. Like, I'm curious about that experience as a reader. Like usually you're just kind of taking in the story, but these kinds of narratives for me like activate me, where I'm like, it almost creates a sense of panic or something. Like trying to get in and like rectify it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I find that interesting. I wonder if there are like, I need to pay more attention to myself. But, you know, I don't know. Is that square? Does that square with your experience? Do you do that or no?
I don't know. And I haven't, and I will say I've just started talking to people who like, I think who've like, you know, fully read the book since it's only been out since January. And I will say no one else has said that yet. So I don't know.
Well, maybe I'm just a weirdo. But something else I kept thinking of, especially since we have this this woman, slave woman on the farm named Nan, who I categorized her to myself as a witch.
Interesting.
Like she's witchy. Like she's kind
of
like
a little witchiness to it.
She's an herbalist, but she's like can talk to plants and stuff. Like she's got some supernatural abilities. But she's spiritual and she's got some deep wisdom. You know, I liked her as a character, and she works in the house. But she is the one who is supplying all the women with cotton root, I believe, is the abortive herb or whatever that helps to keep them from getting pregnant. And what I kept thinking was like, poison them. Like, what if you just took them out and then just kind of like kept up the farm, but like didn't have to work as hard, but like had, you know, like you wonder how, if that ever happened on a remote farm. I guess they had, you know, they have these patrols in place, like the logistics of how they maintained the institution of slavery and kept slaves from running away for the most part. You know, that part of it was interesting to me as well. And maybe I want to say like Mr. Lucy or Charles Harlow, the farm owner, because he was in debt, would have to work patrol. Is that right?
Yeah, I had that. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure if that's how that would work, to be honest. Like, I think, yeah, but
it made sense to me.
But I did have that kind of happening because I just, I imagine that the patrol typically is made up of men who, most of it's probably volunteer, but like, you know, men who are, you know, affluent, don't want to be out there every day. Sure, they want to be out there for fun, you know, occasionally because they did find it fun. But yeah, part of that was just me kind of playing with the class elements. Like if there's like a level of dues kind of required to pay the men who aren't, part of it.
But I could also imagine in a agricultural community like you would find in the mid-19th century in Texas or wherever in the South, that you have all these plantations and farms on these big plots of land, and neighbors aren't living close.
Yeah.
And they're all participating in human trafficking and the slave economy, that they might have some sort of cooperation.
Oh, for sure.
Arrangement where it's like, okay, I'll do patrol on Tuesdays or, you know, whatever.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but like, I don't know, like that's another part of it that I hadn't really pondered, is like how to maintain it. And they must have been, and this sort of pleases me, but these slave owners must have been freaked out. They must have lived in a lot of fear.
Oh yeah, they're freaked out all the time.
All the time.
All the time. And I I feel like I try to explore some of that with the kind of hysteria that happens. But those hysterias and panics happened all the time, like every couple of years. There was always. So the question of like, you were saying that was there, a farm where people just kind of like quietly, killed the owners and kept living? For sure. I mean, I feel like there were all types of arrangements, and there were always, something of, someone got murdered, or someone slit their master's throat, and the town would go crazy because, part of it is to keep other people from doing that, or to keep word of that quiet so that no one knows that that's possible. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so
wait, this is an option?
This is an option, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I think that's what's interesting. What you see in the narratives all the time is like that there was always a level of panic and hysteria and fear, that at any point this person was going to slit your throat, or this person was going to put ground glass in your food. And I feel like, again, I feel like that's often not the thought. I think if you think of like, Gone with the Wind, or, any of those things where people are just happy, and just like, no, this was always rebellion. It was always fraught. It was always tension. And sometimes that's a very kind of like a loud tension, like this person's going to slit my throat. And sometimes it's also just smaller tensions, just overwork. Like, I think one of my favorite anecdotes is like, I think it's a story from, I think it's one of Henry Winsick's. He's a historian, one of his books. And he talks about these, some of the battles that were happening, I think, on George Washington's farm, and how, it's something like just as basic as like, okay, every winter we need to shear the sheep and make the coats for everyone on the farm, right? Both enslaved people and the people in the house, and the white people. And so they would make this dictation to the enslaved people who were working as seamstresses. Okay, so when you cut the wool up, you can, use the good wool for the white people, and then use the the bad dirty wool for the coats for y'all. And they would never do it. Like that the dirty wool would just always go missing. It was just, you know what I mean? So it were always these kind of tensions over like work and like resources, or people stealing food, or just anything. Like, I feel like everything was always in flux or fraught, or in play in a certain kind of way. It's interesting.
It's such a catastrophic moral failure, to not have recognition of that. And it's worth saying, it's like I tend to see things I always call it the gray zone. Like any human conflict, political issue, I'm always like, well, wait, I get confused easily, and I'll parse and everything, but like this one's easy.
Yeah.
And there were lots of people who knew. It's not like everybody was confused. Lots of people knew. And then there were people who didn't. And the people who didn't or refused to know, that's a terrible failure.
Yeah.
Like you just, like it's hard to accept that human beings can be that fucked up. And yet here we are. So
yeah.
Thanks for reminding me.
And I feel like, to your point, and maybe it's helpful to know this, if you did start the commune, in Texas, to be honest, you probably would have you would have been killed and run out of town. You would have been tarred and feathered, which is kind of what happened during the hysteria on the eve of the Civil War. Like the men who were, pastors and so forth.
But no, I planned for this.
Yeah.
There was a scene.
You have a scene
when the evil white neighbors came to tar and feather me and to run me out of town, and I was able to talk sense to them. I somehow I changed them.
Yes, you changed them. They killed pastors, but you, however,
the power of my moral logic overwhelmed them. Oh, God.
I feel like Charles Sumner is somebody we don't talk about enough. Like, he was like the senator in the 1850s who
South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he makes this declaration on the floor of Congress, where he's basically like, where he basically invokes the rape of Black women. And he's like, this is the moral imperative. This is how dark, whatever. And he really kind of goes at it. He is caned. He is beat with a cane
on the floor of the Senate.
On the floor of the Senate.
Right. I remember this by I want to say, was it from a senator from Kentucky or something? Or?
I'm trying to remember I don't remember exactly which state that senator was from. So that senator is disciplined, thrown out of the Senate. That man is lauded people send him canes. Like,
right. But no, he beat Charles Sumner so severely that I think Charles Sumner was like brain damaged, right?
He was crippled. Like, I think he served for a little while longer, but the recovery, like, he didn't never really fully recover from that.
Yeah,
no.
he like beat him severely.
Yeah,
and like so there you go. And like, you know, as
and
you're
that man came, and that man was the man who beat him was reelected and came back to office after he was thrown out.
And you know, this is the kind of history that we need to remember, and it makes me think of the attacks on our history in our educational system that are happening currently from the American right wing. This desire to erase African American history in particular, this era in our history, to either pervert it and turn it upside down or just not talk about it at all. Like, we need to remember.
Yeah.
Like, this was like, you had a senator beat nearly to death with a cane because he had the audacity to suggest that raping slave women was an immoral act.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess that's a separate podcast, but I feel on a related note, I feel that writing novels like this is an important act. Telling stories like this, like works of the imagination that seek to humanize and give dimension to the lives that were led and erased or forgotten about or never heard from, that's important. It would help me, you know what I'm saying? Because you can read a history and that's helpful and a useful thing to do. But to really get like a human sense of day-to-day life and the emotional activity of these lives, it takes a novelist, I think. So it sounds like you've read so much history in your research. I'm wondering if you studied history in college or something. Is this something that you like took on formally, or is it solely in service of writing fiction?
It's solely in service of writing fiction. I feel like I pretend to be an amateur historian, I guess. In my life.
Fooled me. I was like, wow, she's got this on lock. But I'm wondering if you, in future projects, as you envision them or imagine yourself, down the line writing, is this your milieu? Like, are you going to continue to write historical novels? Are you really focused on this period? There are obviously lots of different stories to tell, but is this your focus, or are you going to do other stuff?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've written some short fiction that's kind of, I would say, both contemporary and historical. And I don't find I'm that interested in writing about the contemporary moment. Like, I don't want to write about text messages. I just...
Okay, can I say something real quick? Because I'm writing a memoir right now that I cannot escape text messaging. It takes place during the pandemic. So, I mean, if that's all you did was text with people. And here's something as a writer, as an issue, that like I actually worry about, is I cannot stand, this is very tedious, by the way. I'm just going to this up. I cannot stand the intrusion of a sans serif font on the page as the depiction of a text message. It just cheapens it. It's like, this is a book. Like, and so in my manuscript, I use italics to signify a digital communication. It is an issue. It is an issue because you have to, I mean, if you're going to write about contemporary life, you can't escape like those kinds of exchanges.
Like, it's weird. I feel like even the stories I can remember that are kind of contemporary are like, I don't remember any text messages in them, or I think I tried to place them around 2003 or something.
Well, listen, I've had conversations with writers on this show who write like a period piece that takes place in like the early 90s.
Right.
And the question is always like, well, what was it like? You know, there were still payphones. It must have been such a joy to not have to deal with digital communication in a novel. And, you know, I think I just actually flagged an article this week in my newsletter. There's this article in Slate about the loneliness of people. You know, there's always, it feels like this is something that is echoed constantly, but it's like people are like social bonds are breaking down and people are isolated and lonely, which I think is true. And this author is positing that like, we just need to hang out more. Like, no agenda. Like, You want to just come over and hang out? And like, you just sit in a room together. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to, you could just watch TV together, but just like be in a room together for a while, like stay, like I'm going to go to bed, but you can hang out, I was like, yeah, like I want to hang out more. Nobody ever invites me to hang out. I think maybe back in those days, even though people were still lonely and isolated in many respects, there was more hanging out, right?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I think like also like this, I think also I'm still interested in how people, I think there are a lot of people who talk about movies where the central like miscommunication of the plot now, of course, would be solved by a text message or a cell phone.
Right.
And like, I'm so interested in those. I think I just hit the mic. I'm so interested in those. I don't know. I think like, and it's not even that I'm trying to romanticize like just earlier periods. I think now it's just, I think in this current moment, I just think like we're just kind of drowning in words in such a way in terms of like, social media and like all the hot takes and I don't know if I have perspective on the current moment, but I feel like I can write about the 90s or even periods I didn't live through, and think about it as like, isn't there something interesting to say here or something to explore here? And I think I just haven't figured that out about the contemporary moment.
It's maybe harder to draw it into focus because it's all happening and it's so noisy. It's so noisy to be alive.
It's so noisy, for sure. And
I don't understand how people keep up with the culture just as one. I mean, like you have like the political culture and the political news media, which is batshit crazy. And it's so underserving. I'm talking about television media in particular, but something I've been doing for a while now is I only watch BBC News, which isn't perfect, but it is strikingly different. Like strikingly different. It has a global perspective. You're like finding out what's going on in, say, like the Nigerian election or in Syria with this earthquake, which is like one of these news stories that like I can't tolerate it. Like I can't even watch like that footage sometimes because it's so upsetting. But I don't know. It's like, wow, you watch BBC News, World News America, and then you turn on like CNN and it's like, oh, like America's it's crawled so far up its own ass. All it does, they just mirror back these like tabloidy like storylines to the population in some sort of quest for ratings. I don't think it serves the public at all. Again, we're on a different podcast, but I guess it's all of a piece in a certain sense, like trying to make the world and the country better, which a narrative like this causes one to think about, I want to know a little bit about your history as a writer, like how you came up. You said you're from Chicago. Is this something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, I would say it was. I think I was one of those annoying people who was like at 11, like, I want to be a writer.
What was there something you read? Was there somebody you like glommed onto as a kid that really inspired you?
I feel like unfortunately I'm not one of those people who can say I was definitely a reader always a reader and a reader as a young kid, but sometimes I feel ashamed because I'm not one of those people who's like, I was reading, Wuthering Heights when I was 10 or Middlemarch at 9. Like I'm not that person.
Smoking a pipe in the attic, in my turtleneck when I was 12, reading. I think that's the exception and not the rule. I think I think writers often mythologize themselves in that respect. Most of us were just kids. Like I was a kid, I didn't know anything. But you went on to Howard University. Mm-hmm. And what did you study there? I'm wondering. Like, I
studied film at Howard. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay. So do you have film and TV aspirations?
I'm working in film now. Kind of a long road back, really. So I studied film. I was working as an editor in TV for a little bit, and then was working in advertising for a long time, doing the whole big agency thing in New York. And then kind of went to grad school, and then kind of
went to grad school, or went to grad school?
yes, exactly. Went to grad school.
That's interesting. I kind of went to grad school too.
I kind of went to grad school.
That actually is maybe a more accurate description of it than went to grad school.
And then kind of serendipitously ended up back in film. So that's kind of what I'm doing in LA.
Can I ask? I mean, what is it? Are you editing?
No, I'm working in development. And so all of the, thinking I have been doing over the years about trying to figure out like how to write fiction or how to tell stories. Kind of now it's kind of used in this way. We're trying to figure out like, you know, working with filmmakers and trying to figure out if a script is working or not, and like what they could do to kind of make it ready or closer to being kind of ready to shoot, or looking for stories that are things we might want to adapt.
Oh, so that's cool.
Yeah. So that's kind of been fun. It's like, it's a job I would not have thought about until I got offered this opportunity, but I feel like it's definitely everything I've been thinking about for the last 5 or 10 years.
Well, good for you. Good for you. And so it was Howard, and then advertising, New York City. You said you lived in DC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what was happening there? More advertising?
No, Howard's in DC. So I was there yeah. So I was there, and then I think I stayed for a couple of years, and that's when I was kind of working at like post-production houses and other like small production companies for a few years, and then moved to New York to try to like, quote unquote, make it as an editor or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, those jobs are very hard to get.
Yeah. Did advertising, was that like a soul crusher, or did you like it?
I wouldn't call it a soul crusher, but I feel like people often call it the golden handcuffs.
Right.
Because if you stay in it long enough, the money can get good. And even when you start, the money's not bad, actually. So I feel like I knew a lot of, strangely enough, I worked with a lot of people who wanted to be filmmakers and advertising. And they were, and not necessarily on the creative side. They weren't necessarily like writing copy or making commercials. We were all like doing project management or some other kind of like.
Sort of like how journalists often have like a novel in the drawer.
For sure.
But then you leave New York and you go to get your MFA in Texas at the University of Texas Michener
at the Michener Center. Mm-hmm.
So, and that was good.
That was great. I know there's a lot of conversation about, you know, MFA programs to MFA or not, or PLC, whether people of color should do them or whether they're, you know, in good environments for writers of color. There's a lot of conversation about that, but I would say for me, it was a great, I think I was older, so it meant I was not. So to me, it was kind of like the time, like it was like the gift of time, like for someone to say, okay, here's 3 years and we're going to pay you to just work and write and read.
Yeah.
We're good.
Say no more.
Say less.
Yeah. Well, but I think really like, the point is whether or not the program is funded.
Yeah. Yep. That's the big thing.
If anybody came to me and said, I'm thinking of getting my MFA in poetry or fiction, and the first thing I would say is it funded? And if they said yes, I'd say go. And if they said no, I'd say don't go.
Yeah, agreed.
That's a scam, you know.
Agreed.
And I always viewed my MFA as a shelter. It was like I was hiding out and being able to concentrate on my work and learn how to do it.
Yeah.
And also to find myself in a community of people who were similarly nerdy and interested in this weird kind of niche-y thing. That was a nice aspect of it, because otherwise you're just sort of like floating on your own unless you're like really active at community building and going to readings. And I wasn't tuned in that way. So that was the first time I'd ever been around other people who were interested in books the way that I was.
Yeah. No, I get that. I think I was around other people. I would say in New York, I was doing a lot of the, you know, evening workshops, like, you know, Sackett, and I forget what like I did CUNY's Writer Institute. I would do stuff at the New School. Just all the, like, there's a lot of stuff in New York to like, you know, take a class here and there. And so I was doing a lot of that stuff and belonging to, there's a Paragraph workspace, which is what a lot of writers use because no one has space to write in their house in New York. So you rent a space to go like work. And so I think I was plugged into all of that stuff, but I still just felt like I wasn't getting enough traction on the book the way I wanted to. And
so this book was born for you when you were still in New York.
Yeah, I was writing it then. I had a draft there. So I wrote a draft there. I did the great people at Sackett, the lovely Heather Amy O'Neill, who had read, I don't know, 2 earlier drafts of this thing, I think when I was in New York, which are vastly different than what it's become. But yeah, so I think I was doing that. Went to like a week-long workshop, and had a writer kind of give me some great feedback. And he was basically like, and I think at the time that draft of the novel, I was kind of scared of all the like real hard stuff in it, to be honest. Like, so I think I had written all that stuff in the background. Like, I didn't really want to deal with the rape. I didn't really want to deal with forced partnership. I didn't really, whatever. So all that was kind of in the background. And we talked, and he had read the first few chapters, and he said, okay, well, tell me what your book is about. And I did. He said, okay, I wouldn't have known that's what your book was about based on these chapters. And I was like,
This is the most common thing. Why we all do it. I feel like we all do it. It's like the thing that the thing is about that's really emotionally hard. We will write entire drafts avoiding it.
For sure.
And then as soon as you go there, then suddenly the book works and readers are interested.
Yeah. So that was to be honest, a life-changing experience. That was when I was like, okay, I need to go to grad school. I need time, and I need to figure out. And also, I will say also, here's the other thing too, is that like the level of research in the book, it's hard to do that level of research as an independent researcher. When you're not connected to a university, when you are just like you're on New York Public Library, and the libraries that are in New York are great, but you can't get access to like the real stuff until you are connected to a university, and you can get access to all the JSTOR. You can get access to all the opaque, obscure books that like are not in circulation. Like that's the stuff that you need, that until you're connected to a university, you just don't have access to. And so it wasn't until so basically when I went to grad school, and I just threw out the old draft of the novel and started over.
Did you finish this book at Texas?
Yeah. Or rather, I would say afterward. I was in Texas still. I think the program was over, and it was like the pandemic, and so I was just finishing it then. But yeah.
And you got an agent as a result of being at Texas?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I met my agent through the program. He was the agent of one of my professors.
Well, that's the way it works. And then you went out with the manuscript, and what was the sales process like? I
went out. I think we went out in the fall of 2020. I think that's right. Or maybe 2021. I don't understand time anymore.
No, me neither. I was on. By the way, I never doubted anything you were saying. I was like, okay, yeah.
And I think it sold pretty quickly. I think we had a preempt by Echo HarperCollins. And then I worked with my editor maybe a year and a half. Like I think we did 2 rounds, and then that's kind of the book. And then it came out this January.
So exciting. Was it everything you dreamed of?
It's interesting. I mean, it's great, but I think no one tells you how unnerving I think publishing is.
It's a weird experience. I think the thing that everybody comes to eventually is that the best part of it is the writing itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that publishing isn't great. It's lovely to have your book out into the world. That is what you're trying to communicate with people. But the highest highs are when you're working on the book and it's going well.
Yeah.
Like that creative process is what really is enriching. And then publishing is, it's so strange because the book goes out into the world, and sometimes you hear, but most of the time you don't hear anything. And so it's like, like all of that. And then it's just out there somewhere, hopefully touching a few people here and there. But unless it's like one of these books that, just explodes, but there's like 4 of those a year,
Right.
And so
totally.
Everybody else is just sort of like wondering, but, I don't know. I think like where I land eventually is that even if it is just hitting a few people or a few hundred people or a few thousand people, it connects in a deep way. Like a book like this really works on you and makes you see. And I don't know, I loved it. And I thought that like putting it down, I was very like glad that I'd read it and grateful that you'd written it. It's deep work. So kudos to you for doing it. And I always ask people if they've got anything else in the pipeline. It's okay if you don't, but is there another book happening? Or are you just enjoying this one?
I'm gonna say thank you for saying that. I'm gonna say right now, no, not really. Like I think, especially because I think this book took me so long. Like, and I'm not a person who has a huge amount of ideas. Like I feel like I have friends, and you probably have friends like this. I don't know, or you might be one of these kind of people who I envy, who have they have 2 notebooks full of ideas, and they're just trying to figure out which ones they're gonna get to in their lifetime. I am not that person.
Listen, I thought about this morning where I was like, I don't think I can do a book unless it is like a huge personal thing for me.
Mm.
Like it has to mean a ton.
Yeah.
It has to be really bothering me in order for me to sustain the energy necessary to write a book.
It's such a marathon.
The people who I envy are these people who are like, oh, it's just a fun story. Like, I just like have this great idea. It's just so much fun to be inside these characters. Like, no, it's got to be like a crisis for me, you know. Like, I have to have like be having a spiritual like crisis in order to muster the energy to write a book. Like, I'm going to try. I think after I finish this memoir, I'm going to try to write something. I'm going to try to entertain. I just want to see if I can do it, you know, because my books are always like griefy and personal, and this next one, it's just going to be like, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be entertaining.
I think it's hard.
Yeah, I think but I think there's also different kinds of writers, right? It might just be that this is the kind of writer that I am, you know, and then there's writers who just like, who are activated by the fun of it or something. I don't know who these monsters are, but you know.
Some of them are also just faster. Like those are the people I feel like who also like churn out a book every year and a half, you know?
Yeah. But it's like, you know, it takes all kinds. And I have read wonderful books that were written in a rush by people who are super fast. And then I just had a conversation. My last guest on this show wrote this wonderful novel, Brotherless Night, that took 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And thank God, like you read the book and you don't care how long it took really, you know? Mm-hmm. But you're glad if it's great, you're glad it's done.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So you get to enjoy the fruits of that labor regardless of the timeline. And, you know, look at some of the writers who are like considered canonical. A lot of them only really wrote one great book.
Mm-hmm.
Or they only published like 3 or 4 books in their lifetime. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
It's quality and not quantity. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Tracey. So you take your time, find out whatever that next thing is, and I will look forward to reading it when it happens. Congratulations. Night Wherever We Go. Interesting title. I mean, I get it, right? It's like on a certain level, I get it that these like slaves are, you know, it's never a bright day really for them living under this system. But there's also a lot of like a lot of the freedom that they experience, whatever snatches of freedom they're able to grab happen at night. Mm-hmm. So it's a lovely title. Did that come to you early or late?
That came late. That was more, that came late. I would say my original title was Too Quiet.
It was called Too Quiet?
No, my original title actually was This Quiet. And I think my editors and my agent was like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's this, you picked the right one. But thanks so much for taking the time to talk. Congrats again, and best of luck on all that you have going.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.